Today, we're going to deep dive into what Jenkins is and how it improves your DevOps continuous integration environments. So this is what we're going to be covering in this session. We're going to cover what life is like before using Jenkins and the issues that Jenkins specifically addresses. Then we'll get into what Jenkins is about and how it applies to continuous integration and the other continuous integration tools that you need in your DevOps team. Then specifically, we'll deep dive into features of Jenkins and the Jenkins architecture. And we'll give you a case study of a company that's using Jenkins today to actually transform how their IT organization is operating. So let's talk a little bit about life before Jenkins. Let's see this scenario. I think it's something that maybe all of you can relate to. As developers, we all write code and we all submit that code into a code repository, and we all keep working away, writing our unit tests, and hopefully we're running our unit tests. But the problem is that the actual commits that actually get sent to the code repository aren't consistent. You as a developer may be based in India, you may have another developer that's based in the Philippines, and you may have another team lead that's based in the UK, and another development team that's based in North America. So you're all working at different times, and you have different amounts of code going into the code repository. There's issues with the integration, and you're kind of running into a situation that we like to call development hell, where things just aren't working out, and there's just lots of delays being added into the project, and the bugs just keep mounting up. The bottom line is the project is delayed. And in the past, what we would have to do is we'd have to wait until the entire software code was built and tested before we could even begin checking for errors. And this just really kind of increased the amount of problems that you'd have in your project. The actual process of delivering software was slow. There was no way that you could actually iterate on your software. And you just ended up with just a big headache with teams pointing fingers at each other and blaming each other. So let's jump into Jenkins and see what Jenkins is and how it can address these problems. So Jenkins is a product that comes out of the concept of continuous integration that you may have heard of as power developers, where you'd have two developers sitting next to each other coding against the same piece of information. What they were able to do is to continuously develop their code and test their code and move on to new sections of code. Jenkins is a product that allows you to expand on that capacity to your entire team. So you're able to submit your codes consistently into a source code environment. So there are two ways in which you can do continuous delivery. One is through nightly builds and one is through continuous. So the approach that you can look at continuous delivery is modifying the legacy approach to building out solutions. So what we used to do is we would wait for nightly builds. And the way that our nightly builds would work and operate is that as code developers, we would all run and have a cutoff time at the end of the day that was consistent around the world, that we would put our codes into a single repository. And at night, all of that code would be run and operated and tested to see if there were any changes, and a new build would be created. And that would be referred to as the nightly build. With continuous integration, we're able to go one step further. We're able to not only commit our changes into our source code, but we can actually do this continuously. There's no need to race and have a team get all of their code in at an arbitrary time. You can actually do a continuous release, because what you're doing is you're putting your tests and your verification services into the build environment. So you're always running cycles to test against your code. This is the power that Jenkins provides in continuous integration. So let's dig deeper into continuous integration. So the concept of continuous integration is that as a developer, you're able to pull from a repository the code that you're working on, and then you'll be able to then at any time submit the code that you're working on into a continuous integration server. And the goal of that continuous integration server is that it actually goes ahead and validates and passes any tests that a tester may have created. Now, if on the continuous integration server a test isn't passed, then that code gets sent back to the developer, and the developer can then make their changes. It allows the developer to actually do a couple of things. It allows the developer not to break the build, and we all don't want to break the builds that are being created, but it also allows the developer not to actually have to run all of the tests locally on their computer. Running tests, particularly if you have a large number of tests, can take up a lot of time. So if you can push that service off to another environment, like a continuous integration server, it really improves the productivity of your developer. What's also good is that if there are any code errors that have come up that may be beyond just the standard CI test, so maybe there's a code, the way that you write your code isn't consistent, those errors can then be passed on easily from the tester back to the developer too. The goal from doing all of this testing is that you're able to release and deploy, and your customer is able to get new code faster, and when they get that code, it simply just works. So let's talk a little bit about some of the tools that you may have in your continuous integration environment. So the cool thing with working with continuous integration tools is that they are all open source, or at least the ones that we have listed here are all open source. There are some that are private, but typically you'll get started with open source tools, and it gives you the opportunity to understand how you can accelerate your environment quickly. So Bamboo is a continuous integration tool that specifically runs multiple builds in parallel for faster compilation. So if you have multiple versions of your software that runs on multiple platforms, this is a tool that really allows you to get that up and running super fast so that your teams can actually test how those different builds would work for different environments. And this has integration with Ant and Maven and other similar tools. So one of the tools you're going to need is a tool that allows you to automate the software build, test, and release process. And BuildBot is that open source product for you. Again, it's an open source tool, so there's no license associated with this. So you can actually go in and you can actually get the environment up and running, and you can then test for and build your environment and create releases very quickly. So BuildBot's also written in Python, and it does support parallel execution jobs across multiple platforms. If you're working specifically on Java projects that need to be built and tested, then Apache Gump is the tool for you. It makes all of those projects really easy. It makes all the Java projects easier for you to be able to test with API level and functionality level testing. So one of the popular places to actually store code and create a versioning of your code is GitHub. And it's a service that's available on the web, just recently acquired by Microsoft. If you are storing your projects in GitHub, then you'll be able to use Travis Continuous Integration, or Travis CI. And it's a tool designed specifically for hosted GitHub projects. And so finally, we're covering Jenkins. And Jenkins is a central tool for automation for all of your projects. Now, when you're working with Jenkins, sometimes you'll find that there's documentation that refers to a product called Hudson. Hudson is actually the original version of the product that finally became Jenkins, and it was acquired by Oracle. When that acquisition happened, the team behind Hudson was a little concerned about the direction that Oracle may potentially go with Hudson. And so they created a hard fork of Hudson that they renamed Jenkins. And Jenkins has now become that open source project. It is one of the most popular and continuously contributed projects that's available as open source. So you're always getting new features being added to it. It's a tool that really becomes the center for your CI environment. So let's jump into some of those really great features that are available in Jenkins. So Jenkins itself is really comprised of 5 key areas around easy installation, easy configuration, plugins, extensibility, and distribution. So as I mentioned, for the easy installation, Jenkins is a self-contained Java program, and that allows it to run on most popular operating systems, including Windows, Mac OS, and Unix. You can even run it on Linux. It really isn't too bad to set up. It used to be much harder than it is today. The setup process has really improved. The web interface makes it really easy for you to check for any errors. In addition, you have great built-in help. One of the things that makes tools like Jenkins really powerful for developers and continuous integration teams and your DevOps teams as a whole, when you have plugins that you can then add in to extend the base functionality of the product. Jenkins has hundreds of plugins, and you can go and visit the Update Center and see which other plugins that would be good for your DevOps environment. Certainly check it out. There's just lots of stuff out there. In addition to the plugin architecture, Jenkins is also extremely extensible. The opportunity for you to be able to configure Jenkins to fit in your environment is almost endless. Now, it's really important to remember that you are extending Jenkins, not creating a custom version of Jenkins. And that's a great differentiation because the core foundation remains as the core Jenkins product. The extensibility can then be continued with newer releases of Jenkins. So you're always having the latest version of Jenkins and your extensions mature with those core foundation. The distribution and the nature of Jenkins makes it really easy for you to be able to have it available across your entire network. It really will become the center of your CI environment. And it's certainly one of the easier tools and more effective tools for DevOps. So let's jump into the standard Jenkins pipeline. So when you're doing development, you start off and you're coding away on your computer. The first thing you have to do when you're working in the Jenkins pipeline is to actually commit your code. Now, as a developer, this is something that you're already doing, or at least you should be doing. You're committing your code to a Git server or to an SVN server or similar type of service. So in this instance, you'll be using Jenkins as the place for you to commit your code. Jenkins will then create a build of your code, and part of that build process is actually going through and running through tests. And again, as a developer, you're already comfortable with running unit tests and writing those tests to validate your code. But there may be additional tests that Jenkins is running. So for instance, as a team, you may have a standard set of tests for how you actually write out your code so that each team member can understand the code that's been written. And those tests can also be included in the testing process within the Jenkins environment. Assuming everything passed the tests, you can then get everything placed in a stage and release ready environment within Jenkins. And finally, you're getting ready to deploy or deliver your code to a production environment. Jenkins is going to be the tool that helps you with your server environment to be able to deploy your code to the production environment. And the result is that you're able to move from a developer to production code really quickly. This whole process can be automated. Rather than having to wait for people to actually test your codes or going through a nightly build, you're looking at being able to commit your code and go through this testing process and release process continuously. As an example, companies Etsy will release up to 50 different versions of their website every single day. So let's talk about the architecture within Jenkins that allows you to be so effective at applying a continuous delivery DevOps environment. So the server architecture really is broken up into two sections. So on the left-hand side of the section, you have the code the developers are doing and submitting that code to a source code repository. And then from then, Jenkins is your continuous integration server, and it will then pull any code that's been sent to the source code repository and will run tests against it. It'll use a build service such as Maven to actually then build the code. And every single stage that we have that Jenkins manages, there are constant tests. So for instance, if a build fails, that feedback is sent right back to the developers so that they can then change their code so that the build environment can run effectively. The final stage is to actually execute specific test scripts. And these test scripts can be written in Selenium. So it's probably good to mention here that both Maven and Selenium are plugins that run in the Jenkins environment. So before we were talking about how Jenkins can be extended with plugins, Maven and Selenium are just two very popular examples of how you can extend the Jenkins environment. The goal to go through this whole process, again, it's an automated process, is to get your code from the developer to the production server as quickly as possible, have it fully tested, and have no errors. So it's probably important at this point to mention one piece of information around the Jenkins environment, that if you have different code builds that need to be managed and distributed, this will require that you need to have multiple builds being managed. Jenkins itself doesn't allow for multiple files and builds to be executed on a single server. You need to have a multiple server environment with running different versions of Jenkins for that to be able to happen. So let's talk a little bit about the master-slave architecture within Jenkins. So what we have here is an overview of the master-slave architecture within Jenkins. On the left-hand side is the remote source code repository. And that remote source code repository could be GitHub, or it could be Team Foundation Services, or the new Azure DevOps code repository, or it could be your own Git repository. The Jenkins server acts as the master environment on the left-hand side, and that master environment can then push out to multiple other Jenkins slave environments to distribute the workload. So it allows you to run multiple builds and tests and production environments simultaneously across your entire architecture. So Jenkins slaves can be running the different build versions of the code for different operating systems. And the server master is controlling how each of those builds operate. So let's step into a quick story of a company that has used Jenkins very successfully. So here's a use case scenario. Over the last 10 or 15 years, there has been a significant shift within the automotive industry where manufacturers have shifted from creating complex hardware to actually creating software. We've seen that with companies such as Tesla, where they are creating software to manage their cars. We see the same thing with companies such as General Motors with their OnStar program. And Ford just recently have rebranded themselves as a technology company rather than just an automotive company. What this means, though, is that the software within these cars is becoming more complex and requires more testing to allow more capabilities and enhancements to be added to the core software. So Bosch is a company that specifically ran into this problem. And their challenge was that they wanted to be able to streamline the increasingly complex automotive software by adopting continuous integration and continuous delivery best practices with the goal of being able to delight and exceed the customer expectations of the end user. So Bosch has actually used CloudBees, which is the enterprise Jenkins environment. So to be able to reduce the number of manual steps, such as building, deploying, and testing, Bosch has introduced the use of CloudBees from Jenkins. And this is part of the enterprise Jenkins platform. It has significantly helped improve the efficiencies throughout the whole software development cycle, from automation, stability, and transparency, because Jenkins becomes a self-auditing environment. Now, the results have been tangible. Previously, it took 3 days before a build process could be done, and now it's taken that same 3-day process and reduced it to less than 3 hours. That is significant. Large-scale deployments are now kept on track and have expert support. And there is clear visibility and transparency across the whole operations through using the Jenkins tools.
Jenkins is a web application that is written in Java, and there are various ways in which you can use and install Jenkins. I have listed popular 3 mechanisms in which Jenkins is usually installed on any system. The topmost one is as a Windows or a Linux-based services. So if at all you have Windows like the way I have, and I'm going to use this mechanism for this demo. So I would download a MSI installer that is specific to Jenkins and install this service. So whenever I install it as a service, it goes ahead and nicely installs all that is required for my Jenkins. And I have a service that can be started or stopped based upon my need. Any flavor of Linux as well. One other way of running Jenkins is downloading this generic WAR file, and as long as you have JDK installed, you can launch this WAR file by the command, opening up a command prompt or shell prompt if at all you're on Linux box, specifying java-jar and the name of this WAR file. It typically brings up your web application, and you can continue with your installation. The only thing being, if at all you want to stop using Jenkins, you just go ahead and close this prompt. You either do a Control-C and then bring down this prompt, and your Jenkins server would be down. Other older versions of Jenkins were run popularly using this way, in which you already have a Java-based web server up and running. So you kind of drop in this war file into the root folder or the HTTPD root folder of your web server. So Jenkins would explode and kind of bring up your application. All user credentials or user administration is all taken care of by the Apache or the Tomcat server or the web server on which Jenkins is running. This was a very older way of running, but still some people use it because if they don't want to maintain two servers, if they already have a Java web server which it's being nicely maintained and backed up, Jenkins can run attached to it. Alright, so either ways, it doesn't matter however you're going to bring up your Jenkins instance, the way we're going to operate Jenkins is all going to be very, very same or similar one. With the subtle changes in terms of user administration, if at all you're launching it through any other web server which will take care of the user administration. Otherwise, all the commands or all the configuration or the way in which I'm going to run this demo, it is going to be same across any of these installations. Alright, so the prerequisites for running Jenkins, as I mentioned earlier, Jenkins is nothing but a simple web application that is written in Java. So all that it needs is Java, preferably JDK 1.7 or 1.8. 2 GB RAM is the recommended RAM for running Jenkins. And also, like any other open source toolsets, when you install JDK, ensure that you set in the environment variable Java home to point to the right directory. This is something very specific to JDK, but for any other open source tools that you install, there is always a preferred environment variable that you got to set in, which is specific to that particular tool that you're going to use. This is a generic thing that is there for any other open source projects, because the way open source projects discover themselves is using this environment variables. So as a general practice or a good practice, always set these environment variables accordingly. So I already have JDK 1.8 installed on my system, but in case you do not, what I would recommend is just navigate on your browser to the Oracle homepage and just type in or search for install JDK 1.8 and navigate to the Oracle homepage. You'll have to accept the license agreement, and there are a bunch of installers that you can pick up based upon the operating system on which you're running. So I have this Windows 64 installer that is already installed and running on my system. So I will not get into the details of downloading this or installing it. Let me show you once I install this, what I've done with regard to my path. So if you get into these environment variables, alright, so I have just set in a Java home variable. If you see this, C: program files Java JDK 1.8. This is where my Java is located. C program files Java. Okay, so this is the home directory of my JDK. So that is what I've set it up here in my environment variable. So if you see here, this is my Java home. Alright, one other thing to do is ensure that in case you want to run Java or Java C from a command prompt, ensure that you also add that path into this path variable. So if you see this, somewhere I will see, yes, there you go. C: program files Java JDK 1.8 bin. So with these two, I'll ensure that my Java installation is nice and good enough. So to check that, to double check that, or to verify that, let me just open up a simple command prompt. And if I type in Java -version, alright, and Java C -version. So the compiler is on the path, Java is on the path, and if at all I do this, even the environment variable specific to my Java is installed correctly. So I'm good to go ahead with my Jenkins installation. Now that I have my prerequisites all set for installing Jenkins, let me just go ahead and download Jenkins. So let me open up a browser and say download Jenkins. Alright, LTS is nothing but the long-term support. These are all stable versions. Weeklies, I would not recommend that you try these unless until you have a real need for that. Long-term support is good enough, and as I mentioned, there are so many flavors of Jenkins that is available for download. You also have a Docker container wherein you can launch Jenkins as a container, but I'll not get into details of that in this tutorial. Alright, so what I want is, yes, this is the war file, which is a generic war file that I was talking to you earlier, and this is the Windows MSI installer. So go ahead and download this MSI installer. I already have that downloaded. So let me just open that up. All right. So this is my downloaded Jenkins instance, or rather installer. This is a pretty, maybe a few months old, but this is good enough for me. Before you start Jenkins installation, just be aware of one fact that there is a variable called Jenkins Home. This is where Jenkins would store all this configuration data, jobs, project workspace, and all that specific to Jenkins. So by default, if at all you don't set this to any particular directory, if at all you install an MSI installer, all your installation gets into C: program files 86 and Jenkins folder. If at all you run a war file, depending upon the user ID with which you're running a war file, the Jenkins folder, there's a .jenkins folder that gets created inside the user home directory. So in case you have any need wherein you want to back up your Jenkins or you want Jenkins installations to get into some specific directories, go ahead and set this Jenkins home variable accordingly before you even begin your installation. For now, I don't need to do any of these things, so I've already downloaded the installer. Let me just go ahead with the default installation. Alright, so this is my Jenkins MSI installer. I don't want to make any changes into the Jenkins configuration. C: program files is good for me. Yeah, this is where all my destination folder and all the configuration specific to it goes. I'm happy with this. I don't want to change this. I would just say go ahead and click installation. Okay, so what typically happens once the Jenkins installation gets through is it'll start installing itself, and there are some small checks that needs to be done. So, and by default, Jenkins launches on the port 8080. So let me just open up localhost 8080. There's a small checking that will be done as a part of the installation process, wherein I need to type in the hash key. All right. So there's a very, very simple hash key that gets stored out here. So I'll have to just copy this path. If at all you're running as a war file, you would see that in your logs. All right. So this is a simple hash key that gets created every time when you do a Jenkins installation. So as a part of the installation, it just asks you to do this. So if that is not correct, it will crib about it, but this looks good. So it's going ahead. All right. One important part during the installation. So you would need to install some recommended plugins. What happens is the plugins are all related to each other. So it's like the typical RPM kind of a problem where you try to install some plugin and it's got a dependency which is not installed, and you get into all those issues. In order to get rid of that, what Jenkins recommends, there's a bunch of plugins that is already recommended. So just go ahead and blindly click that install recommended plugin. So if you see, there is a whole lot of plugins which are bare essential plugins that is required for Jenkins in order to run properly. So Jenkins, as a part of the installation, would get all these plugins and then install it for you. This is a good combination to kind of begin with. And mind you, at this moment, Jenkins needs lots of bandwidth in terms of network. So in case your network is not so good, few of these plugins would kind of fail. And these plugins are all available on openly or mirrored sites, and sometimes some of them may be down. So do not worry in case some of these plugins kind of fail to install. You get an option to kind of retry installing them, but just ensure that at least most or 90-95% of all these plugins are installed without any problems. Let me pause the video here for a minute and then get back once all these plugins are installed. My plugin installation is all good. There was no failures in any of my plugins. So after that, I get to create this first admin user. Again, this is one important point that you got to remember. Give in any username and password, but ensure that you kind of remember that, because it's very hard to get back your username and password in case you forget it. All right, so I'm going to create a very, very simple username and password. Something that I can remember. That's my name, and an email ID is kind of optional, but it doesn't allow me to go ahead in case I don't. So I just give in an admin and I got a password. I remember my password. This is my full name. All right, I say save and finish. All right, that kind of completed my Jenkins installation. It was not that tough, was it? Now that I have my Jenkins installed correctly, let me quickly walk you through some bare minimal configurations that is required These are kind of a first-time configuration that is required. So, and also let me warn you, the UI is little hard for many people to wrap their head around it, specifically the Windows guys. But if at all you're a Java guy, you know how painful it is to write UI in Java, you will kind of appreciate, all the effort that has gone into the UI. Bottom line, UI is little hard to, wrap your head around it. But once you start using it, possibly you'll start liking it. All right. So let me get into something called as Manage Jenkins. This can be viewed like a main menu for all Jenkins configuration. So I'll get into some of those important ones. Something called as Configure System. Configure System, this is where you kind of put in the configuration for your complete Jenkins instance. Few things to kind of look out for. This is a home directory. This is a Java home where all the configurations, all the workspace, anything and everything regarding Jenkins is stored out here. System message, you want to put in some message on the system, you just type in whatever you want and it's possibly show up somewhere up here on the menu. Number of executors, very, very important configuration. This just lets Jenkins know at any point in time how many jobs or how many threads can be run. You can kind of visualize it like a thread that can be run on this particular instance. As a thumb rule, if at all you're on a single core system, number of executors too should be good enough. In case at any point in time, if there are multiple jobs that kind of get triggered at the same time, in case the number of executors are less compared to the number of jobs that have woken up, no need to panic because they will all get queued up and eventually Jenkins will get to running those jobs. Just bear in mind that whenever a new job kind of gets triggered, the CPU usage and the memory usage in terms of the disk write is very high on the Jenkins instance. So that's something that you got to kind of keep in mind. All right, but number of executors, 2 for my system is kind of good. Label for my Jenkins, I don't want any of these things. Usage, how do you want to use your Jenkins? This is good for me because I only have a primary server that is running. So I want to use this node as much as possible. Quiet period. Each of these options have got some bare minimal help kind of a thing that is out here. By clicking on these question marks, you will get to know as to what are these particular configurations. Alright, so this all look good. What I want to show you here is there's something regarding the Docker, timestamps, Git plugin, SVN, email notifications. I don't want that. What I want I want this SMTP server configuration. Remember I mentioned earlier that I would want Jenkins to be sending out some emails. And what I've done here is I've just configured the SMTP details of my personal email ID. In case you're in an organization, you would have some sort of an email IDs that is set up for a Jenkins server. So you can specify the SMTP server details of your company so that, you can authorize Jenkins to kind of send out emails. But in case you want to try it out like me, I have configured my personal email ID, which is on my Gmail, for sending out notifications. So the SMTP server would be smtp.gmail.com. I'm using the SMTP authentication. I have provided my email ID and my password. I'm using the SMTP port, which is 465. And reply to address is the same as mine. I can just send out an email and see if at all this configuration works. Again, Gmail would not allow anybody to send out notifications on your behalf. So you'll have to lower the security level of your Gmail ID so that you can allow programmatically somebody to send out email notifications on your behalf. So I've done already that. I'm just trying to see if I can send a test email with the configurations that I've set in. Yes. All right. So the email configuration looks good. So this is how you configure your Gmail account in case you want to do that. If not, put in your organization SMTP server details, which are for the valid username and password, and it should all be set. All right. So no other configurations that I'm going to change here. All of these look good. All right. So I come back to Manage Jenkins. Okay. One other thing that I want to kind of go over is the global tool configuration. Imagine this scenario, or look at it this way. Jenkins is a continuous integration server. It doesn't know what kind of a code base it's going to pull in, what kind of a tool set that is required, or what is the code that it's going to pull in and how is it going to build. So you would have to put in all the tools that is required for building the appropriate kind of code that you're going to pull in from your source code repositories. So just to give an example, in case your source code is a Java source code, and assuming that, because in this demo, this is my laptop and I've put in all the configurations, JDK, everything on my laptop because I'm a developer, I'm working on the laptop, but my continuous integration server would be, a separate server without anything being installed on it. So in case I want Jenkins to, run a Java code, I would need to install JDK on it. I need to specify the JDK location of this out here this way. Okay, since I already have the JDK installed and I've already put in the Java home directory, or rather the environment variable correctly, I don't need to do it. Git. If at all I want the Jenkins server to use Git, Git is a command bash or the command prompt for running Git and connecting to any other Git server. So you would need Git to be installed on that particular system and set the path accordingly. Gradle and Maven, if at all you have some Mavens as well, you want to do this. Any other tool that you're going to install on your system, which is your continuous integration server, you will have to come in here and configure something. In case you don't configure it, when Jenkins runs, it will not be able to find these tools for building your task and it'll crib about it. That's good. I don't want to save anything. Manage Jenkins. Let me see what else is required. Yes, configure global security. All right, the security is enabled. And if you see by default, it's the security access control is set to Jenkins' own user database. So what does this mean? Jenkins by default, it uses file system where it stores all the usernames, which hashes up these usernames and kind of stores them. So as of now, Jenkins is configured to use its own database. Assuming that you are running in an organization, you would probably want to have some sort of an AD or an LDAP server using which you would want to control access to your Jenkins repository, rather Jenkins tool. So you would specify your LDAP server details, the root DN, password or the manager DN and the manager password and all these details in case you want to connect your Jenkins instance with your LDAP or AD or any of the authentication servers that you have in your organization. But for now, since I don't have any of these things, I'm going to use this own database. That's good enough. All right. So I will set up some authorization methods and stuff like that once I put in few jobs. So for now, let me not get into any of these details of this. Just be aware that Jenkins can be connected for authorization to an LDAP server, or you can have Jenkins managing its own servers, which is happening as of now. So I'm going to save all this stuff. That's good for me. So enough of all these configurations. Let me put in a very, very simple job. All right. So job, new item. Little difficult to kind of figure out, but then that's the new item. So I'll just say, first job, this is good for me. I just give a name for my job. I would say it's a freestyle project. That's good enough for me. I don't want to choose any of that. So unless until you choose any of this particular button would not become active. So choose the freestyle project and say, okay. At a very high level, you would see general, source code management, build triggers, build environment, build and post build. In case you install more and more plugins, you will see a lot more options. But for now, this is what you would see. So what am I doing? At the moment, I'm just putting up a very, very simple job. And the job could be anything and everything. So I don't want to put in a very complicated job for now. For the demo purpose, let me just put in a very, very simple job. I'll give a description. This is an optional thing. This is my first Jenkins job. All right. I don't want to choose. This is an optional thing. This is my first Jenkins job. All right. I don't want to choose any of these. Again, there are some helps available here. I don't want to choose any of this. I don't want to connect it to any source code for now. I don't want any triggers for now. I'll come back to this in a while. Build environment. I don't want any build environment. As a part of this build step, I just want to, run few things so that I kind of complete this particular job. So since I'm on a Windows box, I would say execute Windows batch command. All right. So what do you want to do? Let me just echo something. Echo. Hello. This is my first Jenkins job. And possibly I would want the date and the timestamp pertaining to the job. The date and time in which this job was run. All right. Very, very simple command that says, this is my first job. It just puts out something along with the date and the time. All right. I don't want to do anything else. I want to keep this job as simple as this. So let me save this job. All right. So once I save this job, the job names comes up here, and then I need to build this job. and you would see some build history out here. Nothing is there as of now because I've just put in a job. I have not run it yet. All right, so let me try to build it now. You see a build number, you would see a date and a timestamp. So if I click on this, you would see a console output. If I go here, okay, as simple as that. And where is all the job details that is getting into? If you see this, if I navigate to this particular directory, all right, so this is the directory what I was mentioning earlier regarding Jenkins home. So all the job related stuff that is specific to this particular Jenkins installation is all here. All the plugins that is installed, the details of each of those plugins can be found here. All right, so the workspace is where all the jobs that I've created, whichever I'm running, there will be individual folders specific to the jobs that has been put up here. All right, so one job, one quick run, that's what it looks like. Pretty simple. Okay, let me do one thing. Let me put up a second job. I would say second job. I would say freestyle project. All right, this is my second job. I just want to demonstrate the powerfulness of the automation server and how simple it is to automate a job that is put up on Jenkins, which will be triggered automatically. Remember what I said earlier about Jenkins, because at the core of Jenkins is a very, very powerful automation server. All right, so what I'm going to do, I will just keep everything else the same. I'm going to put in a build script pretty much similar to second job that gets triggered automatically every minute. All right, let me do that. Percentage date, and I'll put in the time. All right, so I just put in another job called second job, and it pretty much does the same thing as what I was doing earlier in terms of printing the date and the time. But this time, I'm just going to demonstrate the powerfulness of the automation server that is there. If you see here, there's a build trigger. So a build can be triggered using various triggers that is there. So we'll get into this GitHub triggering or hook or a webhook kind of a triggering later on. But for now, what I want to do, I want to ensure that this job that I'm going to put in would be automatically triggered on its own. Let's say every minute, I want this job to be run on its own. So build periodically is my setting. If you see here, there's a bunch of help that is available for me. So for those of you who have written cron jobs on Linux boxes, you'll find it very, very simple. But for others, don't panic. Let me just put up a very, very simple regular expression for scheduling this job every minute. All right, so that's 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. All right, come up. All right, so 5 stars is all that I'm going to put in. And Jenkins got a little worried and he's asking me, do you really mean every minute? Oh yeah, I want to do this every minute. Let me save this. And how do I check whether it gets triggered every minute or not? I just don't do anything. I'll just wait for a minute. And if at all everything goes well, Jenkins would automatically trigger my second job in a minute's time from now. This time around, I'm not going to trigger anything. Look, there you see. It's automatically got triggered. If I go in here, yep, second job that gets triggered automatically. It was triggered at 1642, which is 4:42 my time. That looks good. And if everything goes well, every 1 minute onwards, this job would be automatically triggered. Now that I have my Jenkins up and running, a few jobs that has been put up here on my Jenkins instance, I would need a way of controlling access to my Jenkins server. This is wherein I would use a plugin called role-based access plugin and create few rules. The rules are something like a global role and a project role, project-specific role. I can have different roles, and I can have users who have signed up or the users whom I create kind of assigned to these roles so that each of these users fall into some category. This is my way of kind of controlling access to my Jenkins instance and ensuring that people don't do something unwarranted. All right, so first things first, let me go ahead and install a plugin. for doing that. So I get into manage Jenkins and manage plugin. A little bit of a confusing screen in my opinion. There's updates available, installed and advanced. As of now, we don't have the role-based plugin. So let me go to available. It'll take some time for it to get refreshed. All right, now these are the available plugins. These are the installed plugins. All right, so let me come back to available, and I would want to search for my role-based access plugin. So I would just search for role and hit enter. Okay, role-based authorization strategy enables user authorization using a role-based strategy. Roles can be defined globally or for particular jobs or nodes and stuff like that. So exactly, this is the plugin that I want. I would want to install it without a restart. All right, looks good so far. Yes. Go back to the top of the page. Yes. And remember, Jenkins is running on a Java, using a Java instance. So typically many things would work the same way unless and until you want to restart Jenkins once in a while. But as a good practice, whenever you do some sort of big installations or big patches on your Jenkins instance, just ensure that you kind of restart it. Otherwise, there would be a difference in terms of what is installed on the system and what is there on the file system. You will need to flush out few of those settings later on. But for now, these are all very small plugins, so these would run without any problems. But otherwise, if at all there are some plugins which would need a restart, kindly go ahead and restart your Jenkins instance. But for now, I don't need that. It looks good. I've installed the plugin. So where do I see my plugin? I installed the plugin that is specific to the user control or the access control. So let me go into, yes, global security. And I would see this role-based strategy showing up now. All right, so this comes in because of my installation of my role-based plugin. So this is what I would want to enable because I already have my own database set up. And for the authorization part, in the sense that who can do what, I'm going to install. I've already installed a role-based strategy plugin, and I'm going to enable that strategy. All right, I would say save. Okay, now I've installed the role-based access plugin. I would need to just set it up and check that, I would go ahead and create some roles and ensure that I assign users as per these roles. All right, so let me go to manage Jenkins, configure. All right, let me see, where is this? Configure global security. Is that where I create my roles? Nope, not here. Yes, manage and assign roles. Okay, again, you would see these options only after you install these plugins. So for now, I've just enabled the plugin. I've enabled role-based access control, and I would go ahead and create some roles for this particular Jenkins instance. So I would say first, manage roles. So I would need to create some roles here, and the roles are at a very high level. These are global roles, and there are some project roles, and there are some slave roles. I'll not get into details of all of these. At a very, very high level, which is a global role, let me just create a role. A role can be kind of visualized like a group. So I would create a role called developer. Typically, the Jenkins instance or the CA instance are kind of owned up or controlled by QA guys. So QA guys would need to provide some sort of limited access to developers. So that's why I'm creating a role called developer. And I'm adding this role at a global role level. So I would say add this here, and you would see this developer role that is there. And each of these options, if you hover over it, you would see some sort of a help on what are these permissions specific to. So what I want is it sounds a little different, but I would want to give very, very little permissions for the developer. So from an administration perspective, I would just want him to have a read kind of a role. Credentials, again, I would just want a view kind of a role. I don't want him to create any agents and all that stuff. That looks good for me. For a job, I would want him to just possibly read. I don't want him to build. I don't want him to cancel any jobs. I don't want him to configure any job. I don't even want him to create any job. I would just want him to read few things. I would not give him possibly a role to the workspace as well. I don't want him to have access to the workspace. I would just want him to read a job or check, have read-only access to the job. Run. No, I don't want him to give him any particular access which will allow him to run any jobs. View, configure, Yeah, possibly. Create, yeah. Delete, I don't want. Read, yes, definitely. And this is the specific role. So what I'm doing, I'm just creating a global role called developer, and I'm giving him very, very limited roles. In the sense that I don't want this developer to be able to run any agents, nor create jobs, or build jobs, or cancel jobs, or configure jobs. At the max, I would just want him to read a job that is already put up there. Okay, so I would save. Now I've created a role. I still don't have any users that is there on the system. So let me go ahead and create some user on the system. That's not here. I would say configure, manage Jenkins, manage users. Okay, let me create a new user. I would call this user as, developer one sounds good. Some password that I can remember. Okay, his name is developer one, d@t.com or something like that. Okay, so this is the admin with which I kind of configured or brought up the system, and developer one is a user that I have configured. So still have not set any roles for this particular user yet. So I would go to manage Jenkins. I would say manage and assign roles. I would say assign roles. Okay, so if you see, what I'm going to do now is assign a role that is specific to that particular developer. I will find the particular user and assign him the developer role that I have already configured. The role shows up here. I would need to find my user who I created and then assign him to that particular role. So if you remember, the user that I created was developer one. I would add this particular user, and now this particular user, what kind of a role I want him to have, because this is the global role that I had created. So developer, I would assign this developer one to this particular global role, and I would go ahead and save my changes. Now let me check the permissions of this particular user by logging out of my admin account and logging back as developer one. If you remember, this role was created with very less privileges. So there you go. I have Jenkins, but I don't see a new item. I can't trigger a new job. I can't do anything. I see these jobs. However, I don't think so I'll be able to start this job. I don't have the permission set for that. The maximum I can do is look at the job, see what was there as a part of the console output and stuff like that. So this is a limited role that was created, and I added this developer to that particular role, which was a developer role, so that the developers don't get to configure any of the jobs, because the Jenkins instance is owned by a QA person. He doesn't want to give developer any administrative rights. So the rights that he set out by creating a developer role, and anybody who is tagged, any user who is tagged as a part of this developer role would get the same kind of permissions. And these permissions can be, fine grained. It can be a project specific permissions as well. But for now, I just demonstrated the high level permission that I had set in. Let me quickly log out of this user and get back as the admin user, because I need to continue with my demo. With the developer role that was created, I have very, very less privileges. One of the reasons for Jenkins being so popular, as I mentioned earlier, is the bunch of plugins that is provided by users or community users who don't charge any money for these plugins, but it's got plugins for connecting anything and everything. So if you can navigate to, or if you can find Jenkins plugins, you would see index of over so many plugins that is there. All of these are wonderful plugins. Whatever connectors that you would need, if you want to connect Jenkins to an AWS instance, or you want to connect Jenkins to a Docker instance, or any of those containers, you would have a plugin. You can go and search up. If I want to connect Jenkins to Bitbucket is one of the Git servers. There's so many plugins that is available. Okay, so bottom line, Jenkins without plugins is nothing. So plugins is the heart of Jenkins. For you to connect, or in order to connect Jenkins with any of the containers or any of the other tool sets, you would need the plugins. If you want to connect, or you want to build a repository which has got Java and Maven, you would need to install Maven and JDK on your Jenkins instance. If at all you're looking for a .NET build or a Microsoft build, you would need to have MS Build installed on your Jenkins instance, and the plugins that will trigger MS Build. If at all you want to listen to some server-side webhooks from GitHub, you would need GitHub-specific plugins. If you want to connect Jenkins to AWS, you need those plugins. If you want to connect to a Docker instance that is running anywhere in the world, as long as you have the URL which is publicly reachable, you just have a Docker plugin that is installed on your Jenkins instance. SonarQube is one of the popular static code analyzers. So you can connect a Jenkins build, you can build a job on Jenkins and push it to SonarQube and get SonarQube to run analysis on that and get back the results in Jenkins. All of these works very well because of the plugins. Now with that, let me connect our Jenkins instance to GitHub. I already have very simple Java repository up on my GitHub instance. So let me connect Jenkins to this particular GitHub instance and pull out a job that is put up there. All right. So this is my very simple repository that is there called Hello Java, and this is what is there in the repository. There is a hello.java application that is here, or a simple class file that is there. It's got just one line of system.out. So this is already present on github.com at this place, and this would be the URL for this repository. If I pick up the HTTPS URL, this is my HTTPS URL. So what I would do is I would connect my Jenkins instance to go to GitHub, provide my credentials and pull out this repository which is on the cloud hosted github.com and get it to my Jenkins instance and then build this particular Java file. I'm keeping the source code very simple. It's just a Java file. How do I build my Java file? How do I compile my Java file? I just say Java C and the name of my class file which is hello.java. And how do I run my Java file? I would say Java and hello. Okay, so remember, I don't need to install any plugins now because what it needs is a Git plugin. So if you remember, when we were doing the installation, there was a bunch of recommended plugins. So Git is already installed on my system, so I don't need to install it again. So let me put up a new job here. It says Git job. Let it be a freestyle project. That's good for me. I would say okay. All right, so the source code management. Remember, in the earlier examples, we did not use any source code because we were just putting up some echo kind of jobs. We did not need any integration with any of the source code systems. So now let me connect this. So I'm going to put up a source code and Git would show up because the plugin is already there. SVN, Perforce, any of those additional source code management tools, if at all you would need, just install those plugins and Jenkins connects wonderfully well to all these particular source control tools. Okay, so I would copy the HTTPS URL from here. I would say this is the URL that I'm supposed to go and grab my source code from. But all right, that sounds good, but what is the username and password? So I'll have to specify a username and password. All right, so I would say the username, this is my username, and this is my HTTPS credential for my job. Okay, so this is my username and this is my password. I just save this, I say add, and then I would say, use these credentials to go to GitHub and then on my behalf, pull out a repository. All right. If at all, at this stage, if there's any error in terms of Jenkins not able to find Git or the git.exe, or if my credentials are wrong, somewhere down here, you would see a red message saying that, something is not right. You can just go ahead and kind of fix that. For now, this looks good for me. I'm going to grab this URL. What am I going to do? This step would pull the source code from the GitHub. And then what would be there as a part of my build step? Because this repository just has a Java file, correct? Hello.java. So in order for me to build this, I would just say execute Windows batch command and I would say Java C hello.java. That is the way I would build my Java code. And if I have to run it, I would just say Java hello. Pretty simple, 2 steps. And this would run after the repository contents are fetched from GitHub. So Java C, Java, that sounds good. I would say save this and let me try to run this. Okay, if you see, there's a lot of, it executes Git on your behalf. It goes out here, it provides my credentials and says, it pulls all my repository. And by default, it will pull up the master branch that is there on my repository. And it kind of builds this whole thing, Java C hello.java, and it runs this project Java hello, and there you see, this is the output that is there. And if at all you want to look at the contents of the repository, if you can go here, this is my workspace of my system. Hang on, this is not right. Okay, git job. If you see here, this is my hello.java. This is the same program that was there on my GitHub repository. Okay, so this is a program that was there on my GitHub repository. Alright, so this was the same program that was here, and Jenkins on our behalf went over all the way to GitHub, pulled this repository from there, and then it brought it down to my local system or my Jenkins instance. It compiled it and it ran this particular application. Okay, now that I've integrated Jenkins successfully with GitHub for a simple Java application, let me build a little bit on top of it. What I will do is I have a Maven based web application that is up there as a repository in my GitHub. So this is the repository that I'm talking about. It's called MVN Web App. It's got